Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Python Exchange. My name is Cameron Riddell, and I will serve as your host for today. We're in for a very special event, not only because Daniele is joining us for what will be a phenomenal discussion on the Diátaxis, but because we are also joined by a live audience at Brookhaven National Lab. Our guest panelists, who we will introduce in a moment, are together with our live audience and will help us with our discussion and Q&A. With that said, why don't we go ahead and introduce our guest panelists for today. Today, we are joined by James Powell, by Dan Allen, and by Tom Caswell. So let's go ahead and have our guest panelists introduce themselves. Dan, since I see you on camera right there, Dan, why don't you go ahead and tell our audience who you are and what it is that you do?
Dan Allen, Group Lead of Data Engineering at the National Synchrotron Light Source 2 at Brookhaven National Lab. Fan of writing and reading documentation and evangelist for Diátaxis. Tom?
Hi, I'm Tom Caswell. I'm also at Brookhaven National Lab, but in addition to that, I'm the project lead for Matplotlib, where Diátaxis has definitely impacted how we think about organizing our documentation.
Hi, everybody. My name is James Powell. I'm one of Cameron's colleagues that don't use this code. And I'm a firm believer that I will never read any documentation you write, but if you don't write it, I will bitterly complain that you haven't provided any documentation.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dan, Tom, and James. As many of you have noticed, we are also joined by Daniele Procida, who is a director of engineering at Canonical, where he focuses on engineering excellence and helping teams evolve how they build and work together. Daniele has made a lasting impact on the open source community, organizing conferences like DjangoCon Europe and helping to launch both PyCon Africa and DjangoCon Africa. Daniele has made a lasting impact on the open source community, organizing conference, is deeply passionate about improving how we write and think about documentation, which is the theme for today. Today, he'll be sharing his reflections from nearly a decade on the Diátaxis documentation approach, how it has spread, and how it has been interpreted in the wild, and importantly, what we can learn from seeing ideas take a life on their own. But I think that's plenty from us. Daniele, why don't you take over and tell us what you've come here to share?
I shall. Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much, first of all, for inviting me. Thank you for the introduction. It's really nice to be here talking to you all. Now, if I've done things right, you can see my screen and I'm sharing it. Is that correct?
Yes. See, it looks like an Ubuntu.
It's a blank screen. Okay, yes. So
yes, well, and now I see the slides. Perfect.
So I'm Daniele. I'm a director of engineering at Canonical. There's my website listed there. That's what I look like on television. I've been involved in Python for my entire software career, which is actually not that long a career now, but it's getting longer and longer. But I'm here mostly to talk about Diátaxis, which is the documentation approach that I've been developing over the last few years. Now, I don't know how much everyone in the audience already knows about it, so I'm going to say a little bit about it to begin with, and you can always feel free to hurry me up and move me on to the next thing, because I know we have only a certain amount of time. So you've probably seen, let's start with the big idea. Okay, so this is, and then afterwards I'm going to talk about what happens when that idea meets reality. So you've probably seen this, and this is, in one image, the fundamental idea of Diátaxis, that there are 4 different kinds of documentation, that they serve different purposes, and those purposes intersect with each other, and that they're all oriented in different ways. And I think it gives us a way to think about and do documentation. You notice I don't say write documentation. I think that documentation is an activity. It's not just stuff that we write. I'm going to run through some of these components. So we've got tutorials, how-to guides, reference, and explanation, ordered in a certain way, which is, by the way, where the name Diátaxis comes from. It's it's Greek, ancient Greek for arrangement across or layout or something like that, because I believe that there is a kind of rational organization at work here. So a tutorial, tutorials are learning oriented. They serve study and they inform action. So think about being in the kitchen. A tutorial is a learning experience. It's something where somebody takes the learner by the hand to complete some kind of meaningful exercise. And it's the most important part about that is that it is an experience, a pedagogical experience. So if you're in the kitchen with a child, what matters in that isn't exactly how the thing comes out, how the food comes out, how much the child accomplishes, how technically correct they are. The only thing that we really care about is whether the child acquired skill and enjoyed it and wants to come back and gained confidence in you and gained confidence in themselves. And I think that's a universal truth about imparting a skill to another. And the things that the child learns, it's not about the particular dish. It's not the child learned a dish. It's that the child learned the practices of the kitchen, like washing their hands before touching food, how to handle a knife, that certain things will be hot, that oil might spit when it's in a pan. So it's the first step. It gets somebody through an experience to where we want them to be. It works just the same way for our software as it does for being in the kitchen. And I think there are certain rules that a tutorial must follow to do that. It must be a learning experience that takes place safely in the hands of an instructor. The pupil will learn things by doing under your direction. And it must be now in software, of course, you're not there in the kitchen with the learner. You're not there in the classroom. So you've got to create a learning experience that's repeatable, that can still instill confidence, that results in success every time for every learner, even while you're condemned to be absent. And it will do this by, just as it would be, again, keep thinking. It's really useful to keep thinking about concrete examples of learning with a person. It would have to be concrete and particular, whereas what we tend often to want to do is to fall into these anti-pedagogical temptations of explaining or abstracting and generalizing. Those things are powerful, but they're not wanted in a learning experience, or to give choices, or to try to explain things, or to provide information. We just want somebody to do things under our direction and learn the skills literally through the body. And that even applies to software documentation. We don't think about the body very much in software, but you look at a beginner learning your software and you'll see that most of the time they're puzzles and hesitations about where to do something or when to do something, which, where and when are about space and time. They're about physics, about what we do with the body, even literally where to click or where to type. There is only really one question you need to ask yourself about the tutorial, and that is, what shall your pupil do in order that they learn so that they can, in this experience, make mistakes safely and solve problems or challenges based on what they already know and experiment safely. So that's a tutorial, which is, in my view, completely different from a how-to guide. Like a tutorial, it informs action, but whereas the tutorial informs study, a how-to guide informs work. It's problem-oriented. It's serving the user's need to get something actually done. So if we're back in the kitchen again, think about a recipe, which takes the reader through the work required to solve some particular problem. And it's concerned with the application of their knowledge and skill to work, to actually achieving something. So if I give you a recipe, it's entirely up to you how you use it. You might decide to follow it end to end because you want to replicate it exactly. Or maybe you just wanted to remind yourself about some specific part of the creation, or there's a method in it that you want to adapt to something else or used with different ingredients. But in any case, the form of a recipe, like the form of a how-to guide, has to make those things possible. So it has to have this clarity of purpose, this direction, this function that enables you to work with it according to your needs, which might not include ones that the author had anticipated. So how-to guide, like a recipe, which is a good model, has practical utility. It has a clear objective. We know where we're going with it. It describes action, and that's how it has a direction through time. Unlike in a tutorial, the user owns the problem. In the tutorial, you, the tutor, own the problem. Here, it's the user who owns the problem. So it can serve only the already competent user. It doesn't have obligations to the needs of the learner. And it addresses the real world. You know, the tutorial, the learning experience, that's safely sandboxed. The how-to guide is for the real world. But it's still like a tutorial. It spans time. It has this kind of story arc, but it can be much more open-ended than a tutorial. And it has to keep moving towards that end. It has to be moving forward. So it doesn't want to digress into explanations or attempts to teach. And it's still like a tutorial imperative. If you want to do this, then you've got to do that. So it informs the user's actions and decisions. And crucially, it's not about the operation of the machinery, you know, press this button, adjust this job, pull this lever. It's about the user's problem. That's what it's addressing, not the machinery. So we shouldn't turn it into something that becomes really mechanically task-based, because it's about solving a user's problem. And it should be like having an expert at your side or on the other end of the phone. You can call up and say, look, I'm in this situation. And they say, okay, now what you need to do is, and they'll say, can you see the red thing? Okay, and you need to check if that's loose, or what, you know, think of the software equivalent. So the how-to guide helps you think your way through the challenge or the problem. Reference, I think, is the most straightforward, actually. So reference, we're still in the realm of work, with documentation that has to serve work. But now it's not about action. Now it's informing cognition, what we think rather than what we do. Reference contains information that the user needs in order to be able to do their work. So again, you can find analogies in food and cooking, where we find technical descriptions, in this case of the food. In software, it would be technical descriptions of the machinery and its functioning. And there's only one kind of obligation here, which is to describe in the most correct, relevant, and complete manner possible. So food packaging, good example. It's even governed by the law, what it has to do, and what kind of it follows certain standardized forms that allow us to work with it quickly, just like a lot of software reference documentation does. So, and this material must be reliable, must be complete, it must be free of digressions into instruction or explanation. It's got to be quite austere and uncompromising. Except for complete nerds, it should be generally pretty boring, because it's about the machinery. It adopts a stance of neutrality, objectivity, factuality, and its structure is usually most powerful when it mirrors the structure of the machinery itself. So, you know, in let's say in Python, you've got some software, you've got your modules and your classes inside them, and then some methods for those classes. You would expect the documentation to map onto that in a one-to-one way, so the documentation would have the same structure as the thing that it's describing. And unlike a how-to guide, reference is concerned with the machine, and it doesn't really care about the user's purpose. The reference is inert, it's out of time, it's not part of anyone's plans. And in the last quadrant, we're still in the realm of material that has to inform cognition rather than action, but now we're back on the side of study rather than doing work. So this is documentation. It's understanding oriented. It answers to the user's need to understand their craft in depth and context by discussing it. It illuminates. So I chose, this is one of my favorite books about food, Harold McGee. Uh, it's not instruction, it's not reference, but it's about food. And this is what explanation is. It's discussion that illuminates and clarifies a particular topic. It opens it up. It adapts a wider view of it. It's discursive. So this book is about the history and the cultural significance of food and eating, but it doesn't try to teach you skills. It's discussion at a different kind of level. So it's understanding oriented. It opens the subject in multiple directions. It goes outwards or deeper towards the past and the future, and it offers context and it makes connections. And it's answering the needs of the person who wants to know more. So it deepens the theoretical comprehension of some practical craft. And it's allowed to go to places where other documentation can't go, where they're not allowed to tread into the bigger picture, into the history, into choices, into alternatives, even why we don't do things. And it can ask questions on our behalf about why seeking reasons and justifications. And it unfolds a topic. This is literally what the word explanation means. Explanation comes from the expliquer in French would be to unfold. And it's about exposing what might have been obscured in the folds of the matter by spreading it out. And that's what we do with explanation. So there we are. That's my big picture of documentation in Diátaxis. I'm going to stop there for a brief moment and just check if anybody would like to raise any questions about that or wants to say something about that. I don't know so much about what the audience know already, so let me know if you'd like to discuss any of that so far.
Absolutely, and thank you so much for the primer. James, Dan, Tom, if you have any questions or anything you wish to discuss before we move on to part two, where we'll talk about the applications and the history, or I should say the applied history in this case, please feel free to chime in. Or if anybody in the audience has a question, please feel free to either reach out to Dan, Tom, and James, or if you're joining us from Zoom, you can use the Zoom chat or the Zoom Q&A.
So for those in the room, feel free to raise your hand and come up to the lectern. I think the cleanest way is just to hop on screen and ask. While you think about whether you have something you want to ask, I'll ask, while you were formulating this, were there other categories that you thought of and decided were redundant or anything around the edges of this diagram in your mind?
The honest truth is that while I was formulating it, I kind of didn't even realize I was formulating it. I found myself there at a certain point, and I wasn't moving towards this. I was trying to solve a particular problem and struggling with a particular problem. And one day I found myself looking at the pieces in a certain kind of arrangement and thinking, that makes sense. And then realizing that the more I looked at it, the more sense I found in it. So look, I'll let you in on a secret as long as it just stays with us and you promise not to tell anybody else who might be on the internet, for example, that I present this in a very kind of scientific way, a very structured way. The reality is that I came to it by wrestling with a concrete problem and just moving bits around until I managed to stop feeling dissatisfied. And the structure, I think it's true. I think that this division between action and cognition on one hand and study and work on the other hand, I think that really is good and a true way of doing things. But that came a little bit after the fact when I started to think about why the arrangement that I had was working.
I think that makes sense. Any questions from the room? People want to hop up just yet?
Very difficult question.
All right. James says he has a difficult question he's holding for the end, and I share that on the mic just to warn you.
Okay.
Make
I
whatever
do have one
preparations might be
question.
necessary. Yeah.
I have one question before we go on. Should any good documentation fulfill all four of those quadrants, or can you have good documentation without satisfying all four?
You don't have an obligation to write a tutorial for the learner. Maybe you expect that somebody who's coming to this needs already to be familiar with all the stuff that you expect them to, and that's perfectly fair. I can imagine any of these being missing. I mean, I think something without a how-to guide, unless it's might be pretty limited, but theoretically anything could be missing here. In fact, even if you just had one of these, that would be fine, as long as it truly were one of them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I don't think it would actually be that rich and useful as documentation, but for example, a dictionary. You get a dictionary off the shelf. It is only reference. So I know that's not, you wouldn't call that, that wouldn't be adequate as software documentation, but it's not, these are not four boxes into which you have to stuff things in order to be successful.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
And if I start with a README of a project and I've also got a single page README, I will still divide it up into parts that I might not call them this, but they will be answering to these needs.
Mm-hmm.
Not all of them, but each part, those needs will be separated in that document.
Awesome. Thank you so much. On that note, I believe we've satisfied the questions over in the other room, and there's no questions in Q&A. So are we okay to proceed with part two?
Well, I'll come on to part two in a moment. I'm going to talk. I'm going to talk about the part where I kind of play a scientist on the internet. Okay, which I quite like doing. So look, you see that we've got this structure here, and you see that tutorials, for example, are neatly separated from how-to guides. But while one serves study and one serves work, they both inform action. And whereas tutorials and explanation, one informs action and one informs cognition, but they still have something in common. They both serve study. So everything shares something with its neighbors. So there's a kind of internal gravitational pull.
Mm-hmm.
And that means that it's very easy to end up with documentation that looks like something like this, where it's a jumble, but also there's no space here for attention to the user's situation and needs. You know, when we're dealing with stuff that's jumbled up, we can't be thinking about, is the user acquiring skill or trying to apply their skill? We are not able to be clear about what the user's doing. So I've got some strategies for dealing with that. You know, that big picture is very lovely for the intuition. And I dig myself into holes with the intuition all the time. And I have to climb out with this is almost like banal as a truth table.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, we have these big brains, millions of years of evolution, and we're so clever and we take intuitive leaps, we connect things, and then we find ourselves in trouble. But this is how I get out of it. Because I often find myself in trouble when writing documentation, and it's because intuitions have led me down a certain path.
Mm-hmm.
And I have to confront myself with some really concrete, simple, almost stupid questions. You know, reduced to that, it looks a bit dumb, but that's actually one of the most powerful things. So I've got the map that I showed you, but this is the compass that gets you out of the woods. The scientific part is this, that I believe that documentation serves the needs of a practitioner in a domain of skill. So somebody in the kitchen is a practitioner in a domain of skill, repairing a car, repairing a camera, using Matplotlib. They're creating a Django application. They're all practitioners in some domain of skill. And I'm interested in skill. which we can also call craft or practice. And the ancient Greek word techne, which is where our word technology comes from. Technology means literally the study of skill. So skill is at the center of this, an understanding of the nature of skill. I think Plato spent a lot of time writing about what techne was. I think it's actually quite interesting. Now, I think this is a universal truth about the practitioner of a skill. I think this is absolutely universal, that sometimes we are acquiring a skill, we're becoming good at something, we are, quotes, at study. And at other times, we are applying a skill, being good at something, or we're at work. So that's a distinction. And also, I believe that skill or practice always includes two sides. There's the side of where we're concerned with correct action, with execution, with doing, and there's the side where we're concerned with truth, with conceiving and knowing. And that's what gives us this map. So if I'm right about that, I've got a universal truth about skill, then there's a chance I might be right that I've got a universal truth about documentation that meets the needs of a practitioner in a domain of skill. So this model isn't about the kinds of documentation, it's about the situations and conditions that the user finds themselves in. And this is how I like to pretend I'm a scientist on the internet. But at the same time, it does resonate with people. They understand that there are these four different needs. I need to learn a skill to get something done, to know something, or to understand something, and they feel different.
And correct me if this is about on track here. It sounds like, well, when you are formulating documentation, understand that it's going to be read by people. And if you're going to be conveying information to people, you should also keep in mind their goals when reading something that you have created.
I think that we actually have to go a step beyond that. And for example, in a tutorial, I'm the boss here. I'm going to give you the goal because I want you to exercise this. I want you to work to the goal that I've defined. It's got to be meaningful to you. You've got to be able to understand it, like the child in the kitchen. It doesn't make sense for them to cook something they've never eaten before. But I'm going to be in charge of that. I know the whole story in advance. I've thought that out, and I'm going to put you in a situation where you're working towards a goal that we share, but I know that route already. Whereas in the how-to guide, I don't know your situation. I'm writing the manual for the pilot's quick reference handbook, which contains how-to guides. I don't know what exactly situation you're going to be in, but I can tell you if you lose oil pressure in one engine, I've got something that's going to help you work through that situation. And because your goal ultimately is going to be to land the plane safely, but I don't know everything about that situation. I can't cook it up in advance. And when it comes to reference material, I've got to be prepared for any goal. The person reading the reference material might be the judge in a court case who's having to decide on whether the software fulfills a certain contract. We just don't know who's going to be using the reference. So we've got to be quite sophisticated about goals and know when our documentation has to be very goal oriented, like in a tutorial or a how-to guide. But even then, whose goal is it? And when it should not be goal oriented, as in the case of reference. Does that help?
Yes, that does.
Okay. I did promise I was going to talk about Diátaxis adventures in the real world. So, I've had a chance to explore and discover this for some years now. Well, first of all, I had no idea it was going to get so big. In answer to that first question, if I'd known, I would have come up with such a cool story about how I came up with the idea in the first place, rather than saying, yeah, I kind of can't remember. So now first of all, I see it everywhere. I used to keep a list of people who would say, or projects that their documentation uses Diátaxis. I had to give it up because literally every day somebody was sending me another one to add to the list, and it didn't make sense anymore. So I just see hundreds, possibly thousands of projects using it, and hardly a day goes by. I got a message a couple of days ago. Thank you. I want to translate this. Can you do a workshop? I got another one today. Somebody writing to me about Diátaxis. Can you? Often they tell me, "Oh, I did a presentation to my colleagues. It was great. Thank you." And I think that's fantastic. So I see it in other companies' job advertisements. Or people talk to my colleagues, uh, when a software engineer is being interviewed, what work have you done in documentation? Oh yeah, there's this framework called Diátaxis that I quite like. Okay, well there you are.
Yeah.
So I had no idea. Probably it would have made me do it differently if I'd realized that it was going to be so much more than me scratching my own itch and thinking that I had something to say. Um, and it gets so big that sometimes it gets in the way of other things. I've been with Canonical now for nearly 5 years, and when I applied for a role at Canonical, it was for a director of engineering role, but it wasn't for this role. It was for another one that I thought I was better qualified for. And then I happened to see this one, so I also did an application for this one. And to my outrage, they rejected me for the other one and hired me for this one. And I said afterwards, but all this stuff that I've done in this other field, and you want me for documentation? I said, no, we want you for documentation. So it has sometimes. I'm kind of resigned to the fact that that's what I'm going to be remembered for, unless I commit a really spectacular crime that I haven't really planned yet. Um, Here's another interesting thing. I want to be right. I want to have come up with the truth. Um, and, imagine that you've manufactured a screwdriver and then you see people using it to open cans of paint. You think, that's outrageous. Why are they using my beautiful screwdriver to open cans of paint? And sometimes I feel like that, almost a little bit offended. But then I remember actually saying on the Diátaxis website, it's meant to be pragmatic. So, okay, well, it doesn't matter whether you want to be right or useful. People are going to remember you because you gave them something useful. So the reality is, I do have a theory here. I do believe it's right. But what people like about is that it's useful for them. And they don't actually care whether I gave them a screwdriver. They just know if they find it useful to open a can of paint, they're just as happy as if it's working as a screwdriver. So, you know,
Mhm.
you can tuck yourself up in bed for comfort with the purity of your vision, but the world in reality is going to have these other ideas. People are going to use bits of what you created to solve their problems. They'll use one idea of it and they don't care about the rest. You think, well, how can you ignore the rest of my beautiful, beautiful theory? You just have to watch them use it, and you can't be precious about it. So people will take what they want from it, and you just have to live with it. So that's another thing that matters. And of course, I want to be right. I want to have hit upon the truth. People want to prove me wrong. How dare they? How the audacity of them. Or the other thing that used to outrage me was that people would say proudly, "Yes, really like Diátaxis, and I've added these 2 extra sections into it." I think, look at that. What have you done to my beautiful theory? You've just rammed 2 things into it that don't make sense. And I would have this urge to answer them and at length and show why, I was right and they're wrong. I must defeat this terrible misconception. And actually, what I realized was they're doing my work for me. So the
Mhm.
ones who, every time somebody, why Diátaxis is wrong, all they're drawing attention to my work. They can't say Diátaxis is wrong. without talking about Diátaxis. If somebody
Hmm.
wants to understand what they're saying, understand their critique, they've got to understand Diátaxis before they understand that critique. And the more effort they put into it, the more they make it look like Diátaxis is something that's so big and strong that it needs effort to be answered. So that it demands them to dig deep, because only big and serious ideas get meaningful criticism in the first place.
Yeah.
And that's,
And
go on. Yeah.
I was going to say, I have seen such focus on on documentation insofar as open source projects are over the last 5, 6 years. And I feel like the Diátaxis has been a big proponent of that, because even if they're not going to apply it in the same lens or the same perspective that you had originally thought, at the very least, they're saying, our documentation is kind of bad. We need to think about this more deeply, how we organize it and how we deliver it. And I think that is just a great overall net positive.
I think that's really right, that it triggers something, and it wasn't the fact that it triggers something that maybe I wasn't expecting or wanting isn't really the point at all. It's yeah. Um but I still have this first sense of how dare they when somebody tries to prove it wrong. But if they're putting together a critique that has to be articulated in the language and concepts of Diátaxis, well, all they're doing is more firmly reinforcing them. So that's interesting. That's an interesting. You have to let it go, because if it's big enough, it will have a life and can survive on its own in the world. Um, I get things which are people proudly share things with me that they've posted, and I look at it and think, oh, I didn't really mean that. And in the end, I just say, great, no need to correct it. People will still look at what I wrote, and it's you realize you're part of a conversation, and people are
Mhm.
going to find their own ways, because you know uh, maybe I've had the last word on documentation, but that's never happened to any other scientist in the history of the world, that they actually had the last word on things. So I think it would be a bit arrogant to think that I had the final word on it. So and also it's more fun to think that you're part of a conversation.
Yeah, yeah. And understanding that you've inspired so much deeper and more rigorous thoughts into these topics.
Yeah, yeah. It's really I get pleasure from the people who want to prove me wrong, or the people who get it, like it, but are a bit wrong about it. I get pleasure from that now. I understand the value of it much more than I did before. Um, there is something, actually. The next slide. This bothers me a little bit, and I see this. You asked me a question at the big earlier. Does something need to occupy all four quadrants to qualify? And at work, where people are applying this, I sometimes see a bit of rigidity about it, a bit of literalism about it. And I think I prefer it when people are a bit looser and they take it and they run with it. Um, I keep having to say, these are not four boxes into which you must shove things at all costs. Our world is complicated enough, so it's not going to fit a neat box like that. And I wish I hadn't called it a framework to begin with. I call it now an approach or a method, to
Hmm.
suggest that it's a bit more active than just a framework, that things have to fit in the framework. People are intelligent, and if they're working with an approach, they will converge on the right way of doing things. Um, so I wish at the beginning I had understood that a little bit better, that
Hmm.
I'm giving people an active tool rather than an answer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because
And
if it was that easy as just a plug and play, then it's it, that leaves something to be desired. It
yeah,
leaves the innovation aspect of it, of how do I fit this to better serve my users, the people I'm conveying information to. Because if I
Yeah.
have a very narrow audience, some of these open source packages are designed, oh, only mathematicians use this. How can I communicate best to them? And does that require me to tick all of the boxes? And if all I need to do is tick all the boxes, then I'm just doing the same thing as anyone else, and I'm not really delivering something unique to my audience.
And like the other things that I spoke about, where I started out with a certain kind, not idea exactly, but a certain kind of posture or stance on it. The answer for this one was also staring me in the face. Imagine if the authors of Matplotlib expected their users to use it only in one kind of way and for one kind of purpose. That you think, well, do you want to give them a software tool, or do you just want to give them a rigid thing that they can apply like a cookie cutter, stamping the same thing out over and over again? That's not what a software tool is, and I think an intellectual tool should not be like that either. Um, I At Canonical, we've got dozens of well over 100 products, software products, and every single one has to have documentation. And all documentation is created using Diátaxis, whether it's a tiny little library or a tool or a big application or even a complex ecosystem. And there are dozens of teams using it. And not all of them have technical authors yet, although I've hired many and we've got many more to hire. And they're not all expert in documentation. So it's being applied over and over again to lots of things. I can give you a little idea of what the scale looks like. This is part of a quality framework for assessing progress in documentation. Each row in that sheet, and I'm only showing some of them, is a product. And those columns are plans and the state of maturity of different aspects of documentation quality. Only one of them is actually Diátaxis, by the way. So that gives you an idea of the scale. I've seen it now in practice over 5 years being used in all kinds of people's hands. And it's been really, really interesting to see that. And the number one lesson is people are just glad to have clear directions. I talked about being right and being useful. Well, the overwhelming feeling people express is of relief. Now we know what we're supposed to be doing.
Mm-hmm.
And that's fine. Often I'd like more debate and discussion about this, but people just want clarity about where you want them to go. And that has really, I had no idea that was so important. And that idea about people are just glad to have clear directions. Since then, I've applied it to other aspects of my work without worrying much less about whether I'm right or I'm going to be proved right in the end, or whether it was the right choice of action. But you give people clear directions, and they're intelligent people, and they will go off and they will work together with your directions, and they will do something useful. Maybe you have to adjust, but that's such a turned out to be such an important thing that I had not expected to learn.
Yeah. I love that you liken this to, at least you took on the perspective of the scientist online. And whenever I talk about academic research or things like that, we're always standing on the shoulders of our predecessors or standing on the shoulders of giants, as the saying goes. And so you've given a great idea, and some people will run with it, and some people will use it just for direction. Some people will introspect it further, like you said, and add more dimensions, even if that might not be necessary. So it must be very amazing to see how this has evolved in so many different ways.
It really is a lot of fun. And I think I've only got maybe I've got one slide left. Yeah, I've got one thing left, and maybe it's something you can help me with. So we've got some time for discussion. Names, people laugh, oh, naming things is hard. Well, this is what I've put myself through over the last few years. And I mean, even the Diátaxis website uses different wording from the wording I was using today. And I haven't changed it because it's such a pain in the neck to go and change all those images and text. For example, I've settled on explanation, but I've also called discussion or background or context or topics and not been easy to land on it. How-to guides, I started calling them, talking about being task oriented, and then I realized that people took that to mean mechanical steps. You press this button, you do this thing, step, step, plod, plod, and that's not what I wanted. So I think I use got problem oriented now because it's richer. The axes give me endless trouble in trying to find the right way to capture what it is that I am trying to do with this. And I've had people become fixated on, for example, one word that I used to make a distinction between not informs action and informs cognition, but practical steps and theoretical knowledge.
Mhm.
And we would have endless debates about that. And then somebody else would tell me, oh, I understood it better when you called it theoretical knowledge. So you can't win. And I don't know. I'm interested to, always interested to hear what people think about those names and the problem of names in general.
Yeah, words are tricky because we use words to describe ideas, but what happens when there's not the perfect word or the perfect sequence of words to describe an idea to our satisfaction? Especially when the more words you add, the more confusing the idea seemingly becomes. So you're at this battle of brevity versus conveyance almost.
Yeah. Yeah.
But maybe now would be a great time to invite up our host panelists as well as the audience. I know there's a question in the chat that we'll also want to get to, but James, Dan, and Tom, any questions from our live audience there? If not, we have a question in the chat.
Maybe I'll sort of set up the question in the chat, which is about do people factor in the quality of the documentation when assessing which software project they might choose to use, and how do we encourage management and technical staff to invest in that? I'm interested in your thoughts on those questions, and I'll say I think we hear a lot from users of the open source projects that we work on here that the docs are what set them onto it, and we're able to let them use it, as you say, as people use not frameworks but tools, to solve their own problems. And it seems to be a really powerful way to organically grow a community. Do you have thoughts on those questions?
Yeah, I think they're both excellent questions. So the first one, think about the tutorial, which is your chance, think about getting that child excited to be in the kitchen with you. And that's what you want to achieve in a tutorial. You've got your young teenager learning to drive with you. And the amount of trust that's involved in that is huge. That's what makes or breaks the relationship. And a tutorial has got to be successful at establishing the same kind of relationship of trust between the user and your product. You only get one chance to blow it often in software. So I think the tutorial is really a key part of that. Even before that, though, because somebody who embarks on the tutorial has already demonstrated a certain amount of commitment, but how good documentation looks demonstrates a kind of posture towards the user that people pick up on. They can pick up on whether you don't care that much about them. It's a way of indicating something. People do respond to that investment in them. And I mean literally not reading it, looking at it just at a glance.
Mm-hmm. The visual communication of the text, if it's just straight text on a page, it's very hard to read and identify what's important. But if there's added color to separate, maybe titles and things like that from the rest of the text, that helps you parse the information. And it also brings you a little bit of aesthetic joy in saying, this person really cares about this project, and maybe it's worth my time to read through this. And I think in terms of open source projects, when Fast API first came into existence, at least on social media, I'm a big social media Python consumer. I do remember people saying the documentation for this project is so good, the tutorials are so friendly. I think that was a big part of what drew a lot of people to the project in its very early days, on top of some of the features that it's offered that people seem to enjoy.
That's really what you said is really interesting. The tutorials are friendly. That's what people will tell you. I think they're telling you the wrong thing. What they're really telling you is the tutorials were successful for me because I've seen many tutorials that are friendly, but they don't bring the learner to success. And people don't experience that as friendliness, however friendly the tone is. So it's the success that makes them feel this warmth and connection to the project and I guess it's community and authors. Yeah, but it's really interesting. I think we often have to look a little bit behind some of the things people are saying because friendliness is experienced by somebody when they have worked through a certain kind of experience themselves. So what they experience as friendliness is not friendly tone. It's something else. I think it's their own success.
Success. Yeah, I love that. Now, James and Tom, I see you have your hand up, but I do want to make sure that we address the second portion of this question a little bit about how do you encourage management and technical staff to invest in documentation? Because once you deliver the code, the project is done, right? And that's what management cares about.
I don't think I'm sharing anymore, but I had that huge dashboard of progress and quality.
Yeah.
Now that's a Django application, but it used to be a huge Google spreadsheet, and I could see who was using it. And there was never a time when there weren't multiple people from the company looking at it. It was open to everybody to see, and it was constantly reflecting their own achievements back at them. And engineering managers would come to me and say, we want to update our project on the dashboard, meaning we want to have a conversation with you about the objectives you've set for us and to prove to you and to everyone that we've done them. So I actually do some workshops on that, on how to elevate engineering practices at scale, because it's applied to documentation, but it could be applied to, security engineering. It's a way of putting people in a loop where what they've achieved is reflected back to them. So I think that's one way of doing it. It's not specifically about documentation. It's more about understanding people's psychology and the way people work and giving them, for example, it's a tool for peer pressure. People often complain about peer pressure, but peer pressure can also be used to get people to do the right things and the good things because they see everybody else doing it.
Mm-hmm.
They don't want to be left behind.
Yeah. That's amazing. I love that. And I love the purpose that this dashboard serves, not just to aggregate information, but also to inspire others to keep up.
It's to drive something rather than to represent it. Yes, definitely. Yeah.
Now we have time, James and Tom, if there was one final question, then we'll go ahead and adjourn after this.
I said the Diátaxis is definitely informed how we think about documentation. And we have the intention of adopting Diátaxis in Matplotlib, but our docs are probably not quite there because we have a lot of docs and pivoting. It's a couple thousand pages if you render the LaTeX. So first, I guess I'm more of a comment. I'm heartened to say, to hear that if you don't have all the boxes, it's okay, because we have very little that fits in the tutorial box when properly understood. Like the actual question is, do you have any advice on how to systematically edit large documentation bases to better align with this, and how do you have the discipline to not start sneaking explanation in everywhere? Because I love to add parentheticals, and if you leave me alone, anything will turn into enough parentheticals to become explanation.
And my answer would be not to do it, not to try to do it systematically, but to do it in the same way that you would get yourself to the top of a mountain, which is just to take one step after another. As long as you keep applying the same principles, literally almost at the word level, over and over and over again, you start to put things into place, and then they start to have a forcing function on other things, and the things that you have got into the right place, because they are based on clear principles, will hold up and resist the things around them and start to force other things into shape. We could talk more about that if you like, actually, at some point, because that's a really interesting practical problem. And it's, I think, a trickier problem than, I can give you nice pictures and nice maps. Everybody loves those. But the problem of actually tangling with real life documentation, that's another one that I think is really interesting.
Fantastic. Well, Daniela, this brings us to the end of the time that we had here today. Thank you so much for joining us. This has been such an insightful conversation on the Diátaxis, what it is, and importantly, how it has changed and how it has spread, because everyone seems to be using it. And if you're not using it, everyone seems to be wanting to get on board. I want to share one final message with our audience before we depart, and that is this. Keep an eye on our webpage, that's meetup.doepy.org, because next month we will be joined by yet another person from the Django sphere, and that's going to be Don Wages, who is from Anaconda as a senior dev relations engineer. I want to thank you all for your time and hope to see you around next month. Thanks, everyone. Have a fantastic rest of your day.
Thank you very much, everybody.